Now, back to the Frontier Freedom Hour with Jeff Hunt, sponsored by Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University. Here's Jeff Hunt.
All right, Constitution Day is Sunday, September 17th. What I'd like you to do, what's really important, especially if you have children or grandchildren, just sit down and read the Constitution, right? It'll probably take you about 30 minutes to read through all of it. It gets complicated, but it has to do with the separation of powers, right? And Yoram Hazony does a really good job in his book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, about the kind of conservative nature of the Constitution versus the Jeffersonian Declaration of Independence. They were kind of written in two different worldviews, and he argues that the reason we got the Constitution we did is because Jefferson was in France and not a part of the Constitutional Convention, because he has a different worldview with regards to separation of powers and the importance of a strong executive, which came through in the Constitution, Federalist Papers, Madison, Washington, Hamilton, all those guys. So there's the world we experience right now, the government that we experience right now has come about as a result of consequences of who wrote the Constitution and Supreme Court cases that we now deal with, Chevron deference being one of them. Our guest today is Sean Nation, who's Deputy General Counsel for Mountain States Legal Foundation. Sean, you were talking about this case that would challenge the fact that the federal government's agencies can essentially just make up their own rules. And this has created a lot of problems. I mean, a lot of them.
Yeah, it has. The case itself, the facts of the case are kind of interesting. It involves fisheries, right? And there is a federal agency, whose name is escaping me right now, that dictates how many fish you can catch, and dictates that if you're out there commercial fishing, you have to pay for a monitor to make sure you're catching the right amount of fish, right? It's one of those things like, who would have thought that this thing existed?
Right.
But it does. And the way they got there is they made up their own rule that says, well, we can make you pay for this monitor to be on your boat while you're commercially fishing.
So like the legislature would say, House of Representatives, Senate would pass a law saying you can't fish 2 million fish out of the Atlantic Ocean. It's going to decimate the Atlantic Ocean. So they do a general rule like that. And lo and behold, this federal agency comes along and is like, well, the way we achieve this is through a monitor, and you have to buy that monitor.
Pretty much. Pretty much. And because of this case Chevron that you referenced, the courts have granted deference to the agencies to define a rule when things are ambiguous. Well, that's kind of pulled out of nowhere. I'd say it came out of the cow's end, if you would.
We get that on the Frontier Freedom Hour.
Yeah,
makes sense to us.
So, what we are arguing, and the plaintiffs, the main plaintiffs are arguing that should go away entirely. Mm-hmm. I don't know that the court's going to go that far. So we have suggested to the court, we filed what's called an amicus brief, which is like a friend of the court, right? You point out there could be a third way. You know, you've got the plaintiffs, and you've got the defendants, and you've got other people who are like, hey, maybe there's a compromise. And what we have argued is that it should just be a tool like anything else, like any other way that you're interpreting legislation. You shouldn't defer. You know, yeah, maybe the agency has some expertise. Maybe it's useful to consider what they have to say. But that should just be like the last thing in the bucket of tools for legislative interpretation. So, you know, the legislature has said there's a limit on how many fish you can take out of the Atlantic. There's a limit. And those limits are probably good.
Mm-hmm. But the key is they've been debated.
Yeah.
They've been debated by representatives of people.
Exactly.
This is where... So Neil Gorsuch wrote a book, A Republic If You Can Keep It, and he really doesn't like Chevron deference.
He does not.
I mean, he like devoted like a good section of that book, and I'm not a lawyer, but I could generally understand he didn't like that. But the point being, if you're going to pass a law, at least allow representatives to debate it, because They're responsible to constituents. This is where I got really angry on COVID tri-county health baloney.
Yep.
Right? You had people that there's no consequence for them. If you pass something that seriously jeopardizes my job, my living for my family, I have recourse. I can make sure that next election, you're not back in there.
Yep.
But when you have these agencies that have no accountability, they just keep on marching, doing whatever they think is in their own best interest.
That's exactly right. And it you can call it the deep state if you want. You can call it, really, it's become a fourth branch of government.
Right.
That is not within the Constitution. It makes some sense, of course, to have these administrative agencies. You've got to have, some way of executing what Congress has said. But what it's really done is allowed Congress to not do much, right? They can create,
just collect paychecks,
exactly, and just sit there and stagnate. And they can pass kind of broad legislation and then say, okay, you guys go make up the rules to figure out exactly how you're going to implement it,
right? And
exactly what it means. And that, to me, is not within either the text or the spirit of the Constitution.
That's right.
You've got this idea of a representative legislature, a Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, that should be making up rules and not just delegating authority to somebody that the president appoints. Because what ends up happening is you get this whiplash depending on who is in power. Take a hot button issue. Let's say you're dealing with kids who are identifying as trans, right? And they're in high school. Well, during the Trump administration, you had one rule, and then when Biden came in, you had a completely different rule. And I don't know what the right answer is.
Ping-ponged back and forth on this, right?
And look, I won't claim to know the right answer, but
I will. But go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. But that kind of back and forth just isn't good for anybody. It's not good for the kids. It's not good for the parents who are trying to navigate a sensitive issue, right? And it's not good for the teachers who are also trying to figure out what to do and how to treat these confused kids. So when you have that kind of authority by an unelected agency who has essentially, they can't get in trouble for anything. Right? Like, what's worse? The worst thing that can happen to them, they get called to the carpet in front of Congress and get embarrassed for 20 minutes on C-SPAN, watched by 23 people. Right. There's no real consequence for these people. Yeah. For instance, one of the cases I'm working on right now, it's called Brigida versus the FAA. During the Obama administration, the way we used to hire air traffic controllers for the FAA was based solely on merit. And during the Obama administration, they decided that wasn't producing a diverse enough group of air traffic controllers. So they instead tried to rebalance things by using a biographical questionnaire. I'm using that in air quotes for the radio. And the result is that they flushed out over about 1,000 well-qualified air traffic controller candidates.
Because of their race. And, they got called to the carpet in front of Congress, and Congress passed a law banning them using that assessment that they were using. But they didn't rehire those 1,000 individuals who had gone through a college training program to become air traffic controllers. Right. A lot of time, years of work.
This
This is their career path. This isn't like I decided one day to go volunteer at a local event. This is I'm laying out a pathway for my career, so I'm going to provide for my family, and they're denied specifically because of their race.
Yes. Exactly. And that's an ongoing lawsuit. It's actually a class action that we have filed on, to represent those a little less than 1,000 people who were denied an opportunity to become an air traffic controller because their skin was the wrong color. And look, I don't care what color somebody's skin is, but we're not making decisions based on that. Right. Like our Supreme Court just reaffirmed that in the Students for Fair Admission cases.
Right. It's the content of character that matters.
Exactly. And when the government does something wrong, we at Mountain States want to do our best to correct that. Yeah. So, New Mexico, right? The governor just passed. the governor just issued an emergency order banning guns. Well, we didn't file in that case. We were getting ready to, but other groups.
Yeah, everybody and their mother filed.
Yeah, everybody. They got there before us. But they issued a restraining order yesterday. Yeah. The court issued a restraining order yesterday, stopping it. We were poised to do that. We just didn't. Another group got there before us, and thank God. And we would have supported them. We will support them most likely because there's going to be future briefing, future legal proceedings. This is step one. It's not the end.
By the way, this case that Sean's talking about, and they tried to do this in Colorado, and Jared Polis wasn't dumb enough to fall for this. So there was a group of protesters that went down. This was in June, right around the Western Conservative Summit, and they were thinking, let's see if we can get Jared Polis to issue a public health emergency to ban all guns. And Jared Polis is like, no, there's a Constitution. By the way, it's Constitution Week this Sunday, Constitution Day. Read it with your children. We're going to continue this conversation with Sean Nation, Deputy General Counsel of Mountain States Legal Foundation, who will be speaking at CCU this Monday for our Constitution Day celebration. So stick around. You're listening to the Frontier Freedom Hour. We'll be right back.